Hey guys, this is Benny Ricciardi here with rotocurve.com, and I'm here to bring you our sleeper picks for week 4 of the NFL season. The idea of the sleeper pick section is what we do is take a look at the ownership percentages from the Thursday lock games on FanDuel, Fantasy Feud, and Fantasy Aces, and try to figure out what the thought process is for most of our peers. What we want to do is see which guys are being highly used in tournaments and which guys are being underused that we think we can get some big upside from if we decide to use them instead of the guys who are highly owned. At each position, we'll find some guys who seem to be going overlooked this week that still have good matchups, and those are the guys that we're going to try to roll into our rosters. Now, I want to tell everybody something so they understand. The idea is not to try to build a roster with completely low-owned players or to completely fade every single chalk play out there. The chalk plays out there are the chalk plays because they are probably in the best spots and do have the best chance to do well. If you're playing in a cash game, you don't want to be looking at these sleeper players at all. You really want to be sticking to the guys who you have the most faith in having a good upside. If you're playing in tournaments, though, you do need to do something to differentiate your roster from everybody else. So it's a good idea to look at some of these low-owned plays, guys who you think are going to be in good spots and could have big upside, and substitute them in for some of the high-owned plays that everybody's using in their cash games. For example, at the quarterback position this week, David Carr and Aaron Rodgers are the two highest owned players that are taking a lot of action from our peers in the industry. But there's a couple guys that are going pretty low owned that I think have some upside. A guy like Carson Palmer is only 4% on the Thursday lock FanDuel games. Palmer is basically somebody who's been throwing a couple touchdown passes every game. That Arizona offense looks really good. They have a tough matchup against St. Louis, so people are off them. But again, for a tournament, this is a guy who could have that upside game that could help you win and somebody that you should take a look at. Same thing goes for Russell Wilson in this situation, especially if they're without Marshawn Lynch. He might be asked to pass the ball around a little more and could be a good low-owned option at only 2.3%. The guy I like the most at the quarterback position, though, is going to be Matt Ryan. Ryan is in a high over-under game. He's at home, and the pace of this game is going to be very fast. Houston has run the most plays of any team from scrimmage so far this year with about 80, and Atlanta is third with 69.7. That means we should see a lot of plays in this game, and a lot of plays means a lot more chances for upside scoring. Matt Ryan is only 4% owned this week, so he's being given about a 25-1 chance to be the top quarterback on the week. And as long as he still has Julio Jones healthy and in the game, he always has a chance to go off for 300 yards and throw for a couple touchdowns. Moving on to the running back position, there are two other guys who I think are a little bit lower owned than I would have expected them to be and can give you a lot of bang for your buck. The first one is going to be Eddie Lacy. Lacy is only about 5% owned on the Thursday lock games, and he practiced in full all week. So while people were worried about the split in carries amongst him and James Starks, now that he's completely healthy and back in there, Coach Mike McCarthy has already said that he's going to be getting the lion's share of the work again. In a game that Green Bay should be ahead, we should see a lot of Lacy running out the clock late. And if you remember last year, that's when he did his most damage. That's when he racked up 100 yards. That's when he got his multiple touchdowns. And I think this could be another one of those spots for him. I also like the fact that this is the cheapest he's been in quite a while. So you're getting a discount to use him as well if you did want to roll him out there in your tournament rosters. The other guy I really like is Devonta Freeman again. Now, I told you guys last week that Freeman's somebody who's going to get the volume. Did I expect him to have a 40-point game? No, obviously I didn't think he was going to have that kind of upside. But again, when we're talking about guys that you want to use at low ownership, if you can find a guy at low ownership who's getting a lot of volume, that means that he's going to have a lot of chances to do something special. And last week, Freeman basically did something really special. Wound up with 3 touchdowns overall, had like 120-something total yards, made a bunch of catches out of the backfield. The thing with this Atlanta team is with them running so many plays and with them having so few running backs healthy, the guys that are in there for them are going to get a lot of volume. So it isn't even a stretch for me to say if Freeman doesn't get hurt, he's going to get 20 to 25 carries or 20 to 25 touches in this game, which is a lot more than you're going to get out of a lot of other running backs this week. He's not in any kind of timeshare. He's the first and second down back. He's the best pass catcher they have, so he's going to be in there on passing situations. And he also handles the goal line work for him. So that's exactly what we look for in a play. A guy like Latavius Murray, who's another guy who does all those things, is going to be 20 to 25% owned this week. If you can get a guy like Freeman at only 7.5% owned as he was Thursday, I think that's some really good value and, somebody who I think everyone's overlooking, but still should be able to put up another pretty big game this week. Moving on to the wide receivers, the guys like Randall Cobb and Larry Fitzgerald, Julio Jones are all 20-25% owned. But you can get a guy like Odell Beckham at 6%, a guy like Keenan Allen at 6.5%, and a guy like DeAndre Hopkins at 8%. Now, Allen and Hopkins are two of the most targeted receivers in the league so far this year, and Beckham is one of those guys who has more upside than anybody else. Beckham plays against Buffalo. Buffalo is very hard to run against, so you got to figure that New York's going to go to the air, and he's a very nice swerve off a guy like Julio Jones. A lot of people are going to be on Julio this week, but only about a third or a fourth as many are going to be on Beckham. If you use a guy like Beckham and he does have a big game, he's going to help you move up higher in the standings than using a guy like Julio will, who will probably only keep you, help you keep pace with the rest of the field. Same thing goes for a guy like Keenan Allen. His price is a little expensive at $7,700 on FanDuel. It's a little bit easier to fit into your rosters over on DraftKings, but this is a guy who has double-digit targets in more than half the games so far this year. I think he actually had 18 targets in the last game, which is crazy. Now, Joe Hayden is somebody who's likely to be on him a good amount of the time, although Allen does find himself in the slot a lot as well. Now, the thing with Hayden is he's very good on those medium to long routes, but he's not very good with guys who have good speed off the ball in the short yardage stuff. So I do think that Keenan Allen has an advantage here. Now, most people are scared away from Joe Hayden as well, which might be a reason why Keenan Allen's ownership is so low, but Joe Hayden has already been lit up a couple times this season. Brandon Marshall put up some big numbers against them. And then a couple weeks later, Amari Cooper last week just went absolutely nuts and basically just abused them. So I don't think Hayden is as good as he has been in the past. I'm not ready to write him off as a cornerback I want to target against on a weekly basis, but I do think that it makes some sense to look at a guy like Keenan Allen in this situation, because Allen could wind up with a bunch of targets, a bunch of catches, and give you a really nice score this week. The guy I like the most at the wide receiver spot, though, is DeAndre Hopkins. Hopkins is a target monster on that team. Ryan Mallett looks at him every single play. He's probably the first guy that Mallett looks at. If he's not open, then Mallett tries to look somewhere else and figure something out. The other thing I really like about Hopkins is he's their biggest red zone threat. They don't run it very well in the red zone, so they do look to pass the ball. And they have a lot of plays that are literally set up where Mallett drops back and basically tries to get the ball to Hopkins one way or another. In week 1, they ran a fade to him in a one-on-one situation on the outside, and he came down with a touchdown. Last week, you saw that they set up the fade on the outside, and he came in on a slant route and caught a touchdown that way. So you know that not only are they running plays for him and looking for him in the red zone, but they're literally designing red zone plays so that they can get Hopkins the ball. And that's always something that we like to see with touchdowns being so important. Moving on to the tight end position, there's only one guy who I thought was really low owned, who I was a big fan of this week. Guys like Bennett, guys like Olsen, they've been taking a lot more of the ownership percentage. The guy who seems to be going under the radar is Travis Kelce. Kelce is only 5% owned in the Thursday lock games. And again, he's a guy who hasn't been seeing the volume that we would like to see out of a guy who we take for daily fantasy. But he is one of the few tight ends in the league that has 20 to 25 point upside. He's a guy who gets his tight end screens, as we talked about last week, does very well picking up yards after the catch, could be a big play guy. Can make a 15-yard catch, break a tackle, and run it for another 15 to 20 yards. My biggest problem with Kelce is he doesn't get the volume. But in a game where I expect them to be trailing against Cincinnati, where they're going to have to pass late, I do think there's a good chance that he could see an uptick in that volume. And if he does, he's going to give you a nice return for somebody who's not very highly used and also not incredibly expensive this week. Last thing I want to talk about is defenses. I told you there are 3 defenses I'm looking at, and I really wanted to see the ownership percentage for them. The Arizona Cardinals are one, and they were the highest owned at 18%. The second one was the Denver Broncos, who were owned at 16%. The third one was the Seattle Seahawks, fresh off an absolute beating that they gave to the Chicago Bears last week, and they're only 9.8%. So of those 3 defenses, I think that Seattle is the one I'm going to be trying to roll the most, because I like all 3 of those defenses, and they're the one that gives me the most bang for my buck. Less than 1 in 10 teams has the Seattle defense on them. And again, they're in a good spot at home against the Detroit offense that has been struggling. So I do think that this Seattle defense can put up another big number for us, do it at a decently low ownership rate, and give us a real big upside. So when I put my defenses in, I'm definitely going to be overweight on Seattle and probably a little bit underweight on the Arizona Cardinals. And I'm probably going to match the weighting of the Broncos, because I do really like the Broncos this week against that Minnesota team. So that goes through our sleeper picks for this week, trying to find the guys that are going low owned and under the radar. Sprinkling a couple of these guys into your roster, along with some of the studs and some of the highly owned plays, is probably the best way to go about making your tournament teams this week. Remember, if you're making teams for a cash game, you still want to stay with the top owned guys, the top options, the guys that have the high ownership percentage. But if you're trying to differentiate your roster for a tournament, these are some of the guys that I would be looking at to do so. Thank you for joining us here at RotoCurve for our sleeper picks. And as always, stay classy, DFS.